Hare Krishna everyone, thank you for being with us in this series of videos of the Gita for Everyone program. First of all, let me say a few things about the preface and the introduction that Srila Prabhupada wrote. Srila Prabhupada had such an admiration for the Bhagavad Gita. It's the book that he used the most in his preaching. And he expressed that in his preface, only 1.5 pages, where he so gladly announced that now his full version, his unabridged version of the Bhagavad Gita will be printed. He wrote this preface and introduction in Australia in 1971. Now in the introduction, which is quite long, 30 pages, all the philosophy, all the principles of the Vedic knowledge in terms of devotion to Krishna are explained. So sometimes when you have to do some presentation and you have to write something, you have to go for an interview or present a class, you can very easily just take up the introduction and you can find everything that is explained in the Bhagavad Gita, very nicely concise by Srila Prabhupada. So the idea of this is that we don't want to replace this presentation or this way of studying the Bhagavad Gita for not reading Srila Prabhupada's books. We want to encourage everyone to please read from beginning to the end. However, we have selected a few parts of this chapter in order for you to easily remember it, understand it, and also present it to others. So let's remember in the overview that we mentioned how the Acharyas and Srila Prabhupada divide the Bhagavad Gita in 3 parts. We have the first section, chapter 1 to 6. Then we have the second section, chapter 7 till 12. And then we have the third section, chapter 13 till 18. This particular chapter, it starts with describing what's happening in the battlefield of Kuruksetra. First of all, what is the title? That's one of the techniques in order for us to remember easily the chapters of the Bhagavad Gita. The title is Observing the Armies in the Battlefield of Kuruksetra. Now, this first verse is one of the most quoted verse by Srila Prabhupada, and he spoke at length about this particular verse. But let's concentrate on the title, Observing the Armies. Who is observing the armies? Dhritarashtra is asking his secretary Sanjaya to describe what's happening in Kuruksetra. Dhritarashtra was in Hastinapur, near Delhi, and Kuruksetra is many miles away from there. But due to the mercy or the power or blessing that Sanjaya had, he could televise what was happening far, far away from the place, and he was describing that to the blind king Dhritarashtra. So in this questioning, what is happening with my sons, the Kauravas, the Kurus, and the sons of Pandu, because they were about to fight. So he wants to know what's going on. So that's the beginning of the chapter. That's how we locate ourselves. The chapter starts with Dhritarashtra's question. And Sanjaya starts describing who is there, who is in each of the parties of the armies that are about to start this world war. So that's how we start locating ourselves in the chapter. The first section is this description of all those great generals and warriors who will take part in the battle. The second part, observing the armies on the battlefield of the Kuruksetra, it's what interests us more. Is what happened with Arjuna when he asked Krishna to please take the chariot in the middle of both armies. Let's remember also that Krishna had taken a vow that he won't fight. He won't fight in this battle, but he will take the role of a charioteer. That's why he's called Partha Sarati, the chariot driver of Arjuna. So the only question that we find here, generally in the Bhagavad Gita, in the different chapters, we find questions by Arjuna and then Krishna answers. But in this particular chapter, we don't find any questions or any philosophical questions presented by Arjuna, but we just find a request. And it's in the form of question, can you bring me to the middle of the battlefield? So that's the connection in order for us to understand what happened with Arjuna after he observed the armies in the battlefield of Kuruksetra. So after that, in text number 21 and 22, after he requested that, he started feeling grief and he started lamenting. And that's the one word. Remember how we mentioned that we want you to remember each one of each word for a particular chapter in a particular section. The word that we requested you to remember in the first section was the amnesia. The living entity, represented in this case by Arjuna, has forgotten his identity, his duty, his knowledge. Everything is started going because of the circumstances where he is situated. So the word is amnesia. But in this case, in this particular chapter, in chapter 1, the word that we want you to remember is Arjuna's lamentation. And that is the message of this particular chapter. Srila Prabhupada explains that due to ignorance, we start lamenting. Due to our identification with the body, we start lamenting. So we observe that half of the chapter is dedicated to describe Arjuna's lamentation. So that one word, every time we think of chapter 1, we think of lamentation, or the perplexities of life, as Prabhupada called it. So don't try to remember so many details. If you can remember at least that word, will immediately help you to associate what is the content of this chapter, Arjuna's lamentation. So we have analyzed, first of all, the title, Observing the Armies. Who's observing the armies? Sanjaya, by a televised power, he is describing that to Dhritarashtra. But most importantly, in the middle of the chapter, Arjuna observes the army and then what happens with him. And the whole chapter, as I mentioned, is dedicated to describe that particular state of mind. So that is the content of this chapter, and we need to remember that it exemplifies when we are in a particular situation in material life, and we become perplexed, we become confused, and we experience the symptoms of amnesia. We don't know who we really are and what we need to do. So in this way, we finish this chapter very quickly. It's a middle-sized chapter. It's 46 verses only. So it's good to know how long, how short the chapters are, and what's their location in terms of the context of the book. So we hope you join us every week with these videos, this series of videos, so we can explain to you, we can share with you the different tips in order for us to understand Bhagavad Gita in a very simple manner. And also, as I mentioned it, explain it to others. Thank you. Hare Krishna.